Okay, so yeah, welcome everybody to this seminar today by Gabor. So Gábor Heltovics is a partner in a venture builder in the Netherlands called NLC. Gabor is a seasoned, I would say, businessman, scientist, entrepreneur. So he is co-founder himself of companies. He has been CEO of several companies, and at NLC he's a venture partner. So they're building, NLC is building companies in the health sector and from centers like the ones that, that like CRG and all the other centers from which many of the audience today come. So basically from basic science. So this is about ventures that are built on data, on scientific data, let's say. And it's a pleasure today to have him here. So thank you, Gabor. I will not extend it much longer than this, but maybe just want to say one thing. Gabor has a scientific background, and he also has a business training and formation and experience. So, and with this, what I want to say is that he's also a scientist and speaks also the language of the scientist, and is accustomed to have the dialogues with the scientists. So, Gabor, the field is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. So let me just share my screen. Actually, on the picture that you put up, my wife tends to tell me that there were days when you were good looking. So that kind of, but obviously that's a subjective view. So let me just share. Can you actually see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Right, excellent. So today, let me just get this out of the way.
¿Todo bien? Bien, vengo de las clases.
Sorry, let me just...
¿Te diste cuenta sobre la web de la web?
I would suggest...
Solo que
I'm just going to mute
creo que no
everybody.
quería hablar mucho, entonces no sé si lo dijo todo el mundo. No. Creo que se lo dijo Marta y a mí me lo dijo. Pero bueno, ahora viajo a Italia. Solo di cuenta. No lo...
Sorry about that.
That's all right. So yeah, I was just going to suggest that maybe people might want to mute their microphone. Anyway, so today what I'm going to talk about, as you can see, the title is a little provocative. It's about value of death investors, and then and that's a certain type of investors that actually come into the entire value chain of investments. I will particularly be talking about biopharmaceuticals and therapeutics, but obviously there are similarities to medical technology and in some cases digital health as well. And also what I want to talk about today is also the key elements of the due diligence process that we typically would undertake, and what are those key attributes that actually define whether a innovation, an asset, is investable for us or obviously other like-minded organizations. So I'm sure you appreciate, you have seen this slide before, most of you, and essentially the point that I want to make on this slide is, as we all know, especially developing therapeutics, it's extremely complex, it's usually very expensive, it takes a long time, and it's very, very risky. And as we all know, moving through the various stages of development of a therapeutic drug, as you can see, from very early research, discovery, preclinical, and all the way to the various clinical phases. I mean, I'm sure we all appreciate if you multiply a number with numbers that are smaller than one on a number of consecutive, then you end up with a very small number. So if you were to make this this equation, multiplying 30% with 63, 31, and 50, you essentially end up with 2.9%. So out of picking one molecule out of 10,000 in the early phase, then you still have about 2 to 3% chance of making it. And obviously the cost of development is very high. But within this realm, there is a very, very important sort of cliff or value inflection point that people need to appreciate. And so this slide talks about what is the basis of the sort of the value of death. On this, as you can see, if you look at the cumulative probability of success of any development, you do see a big jump. I don't know if you see my arrow or not. You see a big jump around phase 2 clinical study when you are actually getting a confirmation of clinical efficacy or an indication of clinical efficacy in patients. And as you can see, until your proof of concept is then the clinical utility proof of concept is demonstrated, usually the probability of success is very low. So all the way to phase 2A, when you're really just trying it out on a few patients, the probability of success is very low. And this is also very important. If you look at typically capital, invest 35 to 40% of all the investment in advancing products through phase 2A. And then once you get there, then people are starting to be very excited about your product, because your balance of probability of success actually jumps from above 50-50, which is obviously a major jump there. So, but this presents a serious challenge within the sort of the innovation paradigm. This is a major impediment that commercializing innovations, especially very early from academia, that is a massive funding gap. When you look at on the left side of the arrow, research is usually funded by grants, universities, academic institutions, and that's basic research, that's fine. And then anything that goes beyond phase 1, getting to phase 2A, phase 2B, is also well capitalized and funded. But preclinical phase 1 and the initial proof of concept, that's a big funding gap. And I guess this picture is, if I'm not mistaken, this is actually taken in the Death Valley. I don't know if any of you have been in the Death Valley, but I actually traveled there years and years ago, and it's very interesting that you can in a day travel in 50 degrees Celsius temperature at minus 200 meters from sea level, and you can drive up to the Mammoth Mountain in the same day within 2 hours to 3,400 meter height, where you can actually play with a snowball, and this is within 1 day. So this is actually very telling how different it gets in an innovation when you actually have proof of concept in patients. Your life changes drastically. But until that happens, this is a very, very difficult space to be in. So companies like NLC, and this is why I call the value of death investor, because the value of death is essentially a phrase that is used in therapeutic R&D and development for the early phases. So we are operating in this preclinical phase where data usually exists, hopefully in some sort of a disease model, in vivo animal model, but that's about it. And what we are trying to do is essentially reduce the risk from the full line to the dotted line, and that is the area or the that we operate, which adds value. And then as you move on to later phases, then the traditional venture capital funds step in. Later on, you get private equities that step in. And also in the after phase 2, especially, you do have the big corporates that are actually looking at either investing through their own venture funds or just obviously in licensing these assets. And this is our operating space. It's the value of, so that's why I call this the value of death investor. Now, so what is this? Let me just go back to the slide. So you see these arrows pointing downwards when you're reducing the very high risk that is inherent to that innovation itself. So what is that we do? Well, one of the things that, and I guess this, it is great that you are all taking part in this training, that you are actually acting against this slide, is the skills and competencies gap. That not only do you have high risk, inherent risk of the R&D, but you also have an added risk that skills and competencies that academics usually don't have to develop drugs. And I obviously and most of them don't want to have, and that's sort of understandable. They want to be scientists. They don't want to. Most people are not all that keen on being entrepreneurs, chasing risk capital, writing business plans, doing net present value calculations, and also drug development itself. The drug development, when it is a highly regulated and very complex process that obviously requires specific expertise, where researchers typically do not have that, and they don't have to have it. And then obviously lack of infrastructure. And infrastructure, I not only mean infrastructure that you have a good lab. I mean, that's usually you have, but infrastructure meaning certain ways that you need to produce, for example, CGMP grade material for the GLP tox studies, all the way to clinical studies and formulations and what have you, that you just don't have the infrastructure and the capabilities to do. Obviously, there are external contractors who can do that for you. So this is where we get in. So that moving the risk line down means that you can step into all these four, competency or skill, areas that are lacking. Then you basically help build early stage companies, and this is what NLC does. It can actually set up companies, recruit personnel, do the legal stuff, setting up the business plans, websites, communication strategy, all that stuff. It can provide funding, early capital for the whole thing to move forward. Actually, within NLC, especially in the biotechnology domain that we work in, we actually have our dedicated internal R&D team. And I think you might have actually in the judges at one or two of our senior scientists participating, if I remember correctly. And we act as a virtual incubator. Again, essentially, we have a program which we call the Kickstarter program that takes a asset and innovation all the way to create a startup company, and then providing additional ecosystem to support those early stage companies. Now, but there is more to the solution of that. And one is that, and then which I will refer to it later as well, is that this de-risking and validation, which is actually a value creating event, is a much more complex business than looking at a single, innovation, a single asset, because very often single assets are uninvestable by life science VCs and additional smart money investors, because they are not sufficiently de-risked within their startup company. And the one thing that we are also looking at, we can in-license assets, multiple assets, single assets from multiples academic innovators, and potentially build these bio platform ventures or multi-asset ventures where you have the internal de-risking as well. But I'll come back to this point in a few slides later. So here comes the other bit. Is the due diligence process and what sort of resources we use. On this slide, you are actually seeing the sort of, this arrow on the top depicts the sort of the process and the major steps in our, in the way we scout, looking at proprietary leads. We assess them, we select them. We create an in-house development process and team to create these ventures. Then obviously the venture, the company, the startups go ahead, with additional capital raised, execute their business plan, and hopefully at the end there is an exit. The very first step is the due diligence, which is in the scouting and selection process part of it. And the due diligence is an absolutely crucial element of it, because essentially the quality of the due diligence process determines ultimately the value of your portfolio, and also equally importantly, any opportunity cost. Because if you spend on an asset where you didn't do a good enough due diligence, not only do you potentially waste that money, but that prevents a huge opportunity cost that you did not invest that money into another asset that would have had a better chance of creating value and success. So that's the quality elements of it. But also there's the duration. The duration of due diligence determines the realized value potential. So just imagine that your due diligence process takes 3 months or takes 18 months. And this is a little story that I had when I was running my biotech company, and I had a private equity investor from the West Coast in the US. And one of our clinical programs, because the manufacturer of the drug product material suffered a 6 months delay. You know, when I was talking to the board and my investor at that point, it was none of our fault, right? So basically said, all right, so 6 months delay. So how much did it cost, that 6 months delay? So for him, the investor, the cost is twofold. One is, what was the burn rate of the company on that six months? Because that's all the other costs essentially just out of the window, right? So what's your burn rate in 6 months? And what is the potential lost revenue? Because you can sell that drug for six months less when they are still proprietary. So literally, if you think about this, if you develop a drug where it will have peak sales of, let's say, $300 million a year, a 6 months delay is going to cost you $150 million worth of lost sales, which is obviously, when you put this into your NPV, wow, that can add up to a big number. So obviously, the duration and quality are very, very important. Also, if you look, and we use a lot of templates, you know, target product profile, selection, investment proposal, net present value calculation, all that stuff. But all of these are used essentially to confirm 4 things. And it's always, and I will talk a bit more in the next slide, what those 4 things are. So scientific, clinical development, CMC, which is related to the drug product, and the commercial viability of the program. And I will give you a couple of examples in the next slide what that could be. And equally important is what resources you use for due diligence. So you can use internal resources, but even us, when we have our colleagues who are responsible for a specific lead, they negotiate and discuss it with the inventors. You form, if you are interested in science and potentially saving lives with drug development, you will form, and I'm paraphrasing it, an unhealthy bond with your asset. You create positive bias, whether you like it or not. And then that sort of, that clouds your vision. So that's very important to realize that. The first thing is, as we always say in, you know, in very high risk businesses, if the inherent risk is very high, what you really need to try to do is avoid or minimize unforced errors, because that's the only thing you can control, unforced errors. If you make an unforced error, that obviously adds a huge additional risk on top of the inherent risk of the business. Now, so the other thing is, so you can go to external sources where this positive bias doesn't exist. So there are the unpaid ones, and we obviously talk to people, KOLs, you know, but if they don't charge money, you know, you get what you pay for. Those, the advice that is usually of really limited value. Or you have the professional for-profit companies that do due diligence for a living. They provide independent validation, confirmation of the business strategy, and also they can act later on as potential exit advisors. So that is a very, very important piece of due diligence. So let me just get you a bit more detailedly. So here you can see a list of 10 specific questions that you are that you can ask within the due diligence process, and we typically ask them. And these 10 questions really are sort of self-explanatory, right? You're looking at scientific evidence of feasibility on the specific target of innovation. Compare it to similar drugs. What's the medical need? What does the target product profile look like? So if you create essentially the description of a potential drug product at that point, you're looking at what would be the high level development plan and costs and timelines and probabilities of success within the entire development process. An absolutely crucial one is the reimbursement potential. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples why. And then, you know, you do the NPV, and then obviously the patent and intellectual property status and strategy is critical. And all these add up to those 4 points: scientific, clinical development, CMC and commercial viability of the asset. And on the clinical viability, let me just give you an example of how important it is that most people don't, or some people don't realize that. One is, you work, for example, you see a beautiful, fantastic preclinical or research paper or idea that you can go and figure out how you think you can treat Alzheimer's disease, right? For about 30 years, there hasn't been a successful Alzheimer's drug developed. Now, however good the preclinical data is, you need to take into account that a phase 3 study in Alzheimer's disease is going to cost you up to $700 million, you know, taking 5 to 10 years. And someone needs to finance that. So if you look at that with the balance of probability of success for us and for a lot of investors, that would be a program that we would never touch, because essentially we just don't see that there is a viable clinical development path that is financeable for that process. Also, reimbursement potential is extremely important. If you are not in first in class in that disease category, or your best in class status is not, you don't have a big enough gap to the currently available medication, reimbursement is going to be very pushed. And then if you look at the US market, when obviously these private insurance companies provide reimbursement, if they don't like it, if they think that you are not really giving them a huge jump either in the level of care or the total cost of care, which if you can improve the total cost of care, then they are willing to give you a good reimbursement, then you have a really hard time to develop that drug. So all these you need to think about very early on. Otherwise, you can end up with very expensive mistakes in the future. So the next slide is just a little visual representation. When we ask for a short initial due diligence report from one of the suppliers that we would work with, who do this for a living, we would get these level of details. You see, I mean, just look at how many, you know, how a lot is written on each slide. So they are going really, really deep. They're looking at preclinical, clinical studies, potential licensees, eligible patients and sales potential, target indications, competitive landscapes, all that. And these are sort of these are the must-do categories when you assess assets. And then comes the in-house development when, and this is again the added value, where we would actually be looking at creating what we would call a pre-venture or preclinical, non-clinical development program business plan, which actually details down to, you know, in vivo and ex vivo experiments, you know, exploratory tox studies, everything, the data that we need to generate to get to a point that what we call a pre-IND meeting with the FDA. A pre-IND meeting is you go in only with non-clinical data. You don't have to have your GLP tox study done, and you talk to the FDA. You have an idea how you want to develop it through the clinical process, and the FDA usually gives you very, very good advice how to move forward. So this is all goes in. All this work goes in before you actually incorporate the company for the full development. Now, and this is also very important in terms of, I have no idea why the color changed to orange, whatever this color is. But anyway, I hope you can still read it. So the venture viability, once we create a startup company, is also a very, very important consideration, especially in our portfolio of companies that are very early on. And the first statement is very important because single asset wonders are very rare in biotech. Single asset wonders, you have this saying, single trick ponies. The problem is that if you have a single asset or a single indication and you want to build a biotech company and get financing, people don't like one shots on target. So at the time of formation, your ability to raise venture capital or private equity financing to reach these clinical value inflection points are extremely important, that you have a company adequately de-risked within itself to have multiple shots on goal. So this means that biotech ventures have to have internal risk mitigation strategies, again, multiple shots on goal. The asset has to be ready at least to the pre-IND meeting when its value inflection points that I have just described before. And, which is also very, very important, you have to have a credible and adequately incentivized management to execute the business plan. So there you need a CEO and the key scientists on board that they want to stay with the company. You know, they are paid, or with some CEOs who have had the number of successful companies, they are happy with, you know, shares getting in the company and not being paid for a certain period of time until a large amount of capital is raised. But that is certainly something that is very important. So venture viability is, again, with everything else moving well, is also a very important consideration. Now, the other thing that we as a venture capital, early stage venture capital company are looking at is portfolio strategies. So first of all, we are trying to build portfolios that have a balance between the various, you know, for example, in diseases, you have an acute disease, chronic disease. With acute diseases, the clinical development is quicker. With chronic diseases, the market is quicker. You know, you have novel therapies, but sometimes drug repositioning is great because then that's a much quicker and less risky route. You have rare orphan diseases where developing the drug is much quicker with the FDA, and then it comes with additional perks such as priority review vouchers, or you have these large major indications where obviously the market potential is absolutely massive. So we want to build a portfolio that actually is de-risked or balanced from that setting as well. And also, if you have single assets that themselves are great, but on their own would be difficult to build a company around, potentially you can find ways of pooling such assets and creating multi-asset companies, or potentially, obviously, looking at technology platform projects that could also be built as bioplatform companies. And finally, I would like to ask, get you to a little quiz. I don't know how you're going to answer this, but it would be interesting to see, your thoughts on this. So which one of these drugs, the market, i.e. investors would want to develop most, i.e. which one would you think they would want to invest in? So a drug to treat a rare genetic disease that really only affects 2,000 patients in the entire world a year. A painkiller that works extremely fast in 15 minutes in any conditions, any shape or form. You take it, you have onset of pain relief in 15 minutes, no matter what. A new antibiotic that treats the worst multi-resistant bacterial infections. So this is an absolute must in our world. Or a new anti-malaria drug that essentially would change the paradigm of eradicating essentially the symptoms and the effects of malaria infection. Okay, so I don't know how would you do this, Paul?
Put in right in the chat. 1, 2, 3, or 4 would be the
right. All right. So let's just see. So I see a lot of twos.
Yeah. There was 1, 1. Lots of twos. Couple of threes as well.
Okay, 2. All right. Painkiller, but the market is competitive. 3, 2, 3, 4, 1. Someone is going full Monty. All right. Okay. Right. So I think, let me just look at how many right answers are here. Let me just see. Actually, pretty much 0. Which is good, because that's the whole point of this exercise. If all of you got it, then all right. So the one that people would love to develop most is actually the rare disease drug. And I'll tell you why the other ones don't work. The painkiller that and I put the painkiller is because I screwed that one up when I had a company. We had phase 1 clinical data on this. And the reason that doesn't work is that, we went to the KOLs, we developed a truly remarkable painkiller, and we had phase 1 data which obviously pharmacokinetics. So actually you see the blood levels and you know what the therapeutic level is. So we were pretty sure that it's going to work. We didn't go into the actual pivotal study, thankfully. And then we talked to KOLs beforehand, key opinion leaders who are, treating patients major, and everyone loved it. We did a study and basically everyone said, if that drug is on the market, I'm just going to use it. So the conversion was 100%. Brilliant. And then we talked to reimbursement specialists when we were thinking about investing a hell of a lot more money into that drug. And the reimbursement specialist says, well, you know what your problem is? Ibuprofen in the US, you can buy these huge, plastic bottles where you have hundreds of these pills. And the cost of each pill is what, 10 cents. So for you to have a proprietary painkiller that acts 3 times as fast, you would have to charge about $15 per pill. And the reimbursement will never cover that because the insurance companies will say, well, you know what? It's not worth for me $14.90 per pill just so the patients don't suffer, longer than 15 minutes and they get that's not going to work. New antibiotic. There is a reason where there's a huge lag behind developing antibiotics. It's a new class of antibiotics. And the reason isn't that we would not be able to develop them. The reason is because if you develop an antibiotic that is as good as it says, that essentially treats all the multi-resistant infection, that's going to be the last line of therapy. So all the hospitals will just keep this antibiotic on the shelf and they only treat patients where all the other antibiotics fail. So your market is going to be tiny. And you cannot charge, and then, by the way, for one patient, it takes what, a week's course to treat a patient? So how much are you going to charge for a week's course of an antibiotic? You're certainly not going to charge, $50,000 for it. So essentially, economically, it's not viable to develop them. So that's why it has a huge social impact. But farmers, if you just think about the money point of view, you will not get financing for this. An anti-malaria drug, actually, that is probably changing now because of the global warming, that now the rich and wealthy Western countries are facing malaria as it is coming up from Africa with the global warming. But previously, why do you think there were no new anti-malaria drugs? Because who did that malaria infect? The poor African population that has no buying potential. So who's going to pay for an expensive drug? So and I think this is very, very telling how, difficult it is and counterintuitive very often to assess assets that are worth. Oh, and the rare disease, cystic fibrosis. Vertex developed a drug or combination of drugs that treats cystic fibrosis, which is a very, very bad disease. That's actually in the Western world where actually people survive with cystic fibrosis long enough. You get it at, it's a deteriorating disease of your lung, and then you essentially suffocate and die horribly by the age of 20, 25. This disease comes at around 2 to 3 years old. Their drug, if you take that drug, essentially, that if it works for you, you can live for a full, lifespan. That drug currently is it costs roughly about $250,000 per patient per year, and there is reimbursement for this. So reimbursement companies pay $250,000, and just multiply that. The patient will need to take that drug for 50 years. Now, clearly, there will be generic versions of that, but for that 10, 15 years, whilst it's not a generic, just add the numbers up. Vertex raised $8 billion to develop those drugs from the market. So, and I think that's me. I'm done. So thank you so much for your attention. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, let's put your hand up if you've got questions. It's probably the easiest to control it.
Oh, there is one. So please just moderate or just talk, whatever.
So Luis, I think Luis, maybe you can start. That's the first one I saw.
I just put a clapping emoji, not I didn't have a question.
Oh, just a clapping emoji.
So the second one I see is Michael. Michael, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's just kind of maybe more of an observation. It's maybe, yeah, kind of everything's left up to the market sort of power. You know, it doesn't seem to be that great for human health in general. It's more an observation, right? I know, for example, like in my old job, one of the projects we were working on was, you know, antibiotics, and a lot of the time it was, you know, when you write in the applications, it was always like, oh, but there's no market. But of course, I think now that antibiotics is a little bit more action now from governments to make, you know, pricing models more attractive for pharma companies to actually invest in these things, rather than just leaving it up to sort of, okay, this is the market demand that they have. You know, I think for a lot of these cases that you've highlighted, but at least the malarial and the antibiotic, it's not really solved by the market. It needs to be solved by policy and, you know, kind of changing the pricing models of these things.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree. And this is exactly the point. I was actually going to be provocative here, thought-provoking. And this is precisely this exercise. I've done this sort of exercise, you know, from high schools to various venues. And this provokes a lot of thought. And the reason is absolutely right that you know, governments have a role, because there is such a huge social impact of how and what we develop drugs for. And there are obviously philanthropists like the Bill Gates Foundation and others that are actually trying to get in the game, and non-dilutive financing in the early phase. But I completely agree that these are massively important aspects of it. And there are ways that the regulators are trying. For example, with rare diseases or orphan diseases that are where you essentially have no treatment for a disease. The FDA has, I don't know if you guys have heard this, called the priority review voucher process. So if you go as a pharmaceutical company and develop a orphan drug successfully, they give you a priority review voucher, which actually you can sell. This is actually commercially sellable to other companies. That means that if you come up with another drug that is just a drug, you know, FDA, because it's extremely busy, FDA usually takes 2 to 3 years to actually even start reviewing your new drug application. So that 2 to 3 years is lost sales, as I described before. So if you actually go in with a priority voucher, review voucher, they will start immediately. And the commercial value of a voucher like that is between $80 to $100 million. So if you are a small company and you're a startup company and say, I want to develop an orphan disease drug, this is actually part of your NPV, a calculation to your investor that, oh, I'm going to get a priority review voucher. So potentially I'm going to be worth, and that's like free money, because you sell the voucher and essentially you get your 80, I mean, it's a free market. So the price fluctuates, but that's about it. The recent sales were about $80 to $100 million. So there are ways of going around this, but these big questions are indeed, I agree, that requires, you know, majoring contribution from policy to resolve.
Sorry, can I ask how many of these markets are available? How many of these vouchers exist in the market currently?
I don't know, but you get it by definition if you develop an orphan drug. But I don't know. But I'm sure you can Google that. I have no idea.
Gabor, I see another question by Savas.
I have a question, Gabor. Putting myself in the shoes of a founder inventor, do you think this is all worthwhile for them? You know, they leave the safety of academia. They go in this process. It's a long process with no guarantees at all. And eventually, if they're lucky, they get into a company that eventually is funded and goes forward. Are they rewarded adequately for that massively long, hard, risky road?
Well, there are two ways of going about this. So if you feel like you're an academic and you're like an entrepreneur, and then you really feel like, I want to leave all the academic stuff behind and I want to get in the gear of all this, shit, excuse my French, right? But right, so but most of the time, for example, what we do at NLC is that we don't need the academic inventor to actually become an entrepreneur. We will do that for you, and you will get you will only get upside. I mean, if this whole thing is successful, you will have shares, you will have milestone payments, you will have royalties that will come in at the end of it. So there are companies like us that go in and essentially take it off your shoulders. I mean, you contribute as maybe a chief scientific officer part-time. You certainly are part of the development of the program, but you don't need to do any of this, because there will be professionals who understand what they are doing, and that's what they actually do for a living. So that is very attractive to many people, because you know there are these. I mean, we talk to some of these scientists who are actually having a school underneath them. PhD students, postdocs, masters that they are working on, and they are developing this. They have a core hub that's a lot of innovation comes from them, and they will certainly not leave that behind. The technology transfer of it comes. We negotiate a license agreement, take the asset, and we try to develop it with their support, of course.
Okay. Thank you.
Was there a question by Sabas?
It was answered. Thank you.
Okay. So maybe I also have a question, Gabor. So, like, what is, if you can give us some advice, so the audience today is mainly researchers in their early stages of their career, and so they are now developing the knowledge or the technologies, right? And you presented a roadmap that is like very far away down the line, because when you were talking about the due diligence and saying, well, what's the moment to incorporate your company or going to IND, and all this sounds so very late. So for me, the question would be, what is the right moment for an entrepreneur or for a scientist that is seeing an application of its research? What's the moment to approach a venture builder or a technology transfer office when they really say, well, this is the moment to start the company for me? What would you say is the right moment?
So obviously there are different ones. So if you think about therapeutics, if you have, well, first of all, you really need to believe in it, number one. No, seriously. So, I mean, there are people who just do this for going through the motions. There are people who passionately believe in it. So that's important. And the other thing is have some sort of proof of principle in some sort of disease models, because that's the extremely important point. And it can be, as little as, to give you an example, there are different ones. The classical ones are disease models in animals, right? So you have, I don't know, you can have a disease model for inflammatory bowel disease in a mice, and then you add your compound and you see the effect on the inflammation. Or you can have a model which, these organoids, where you take patient samples from patients that actually have diseased either pancreatitis or cancer or whatever it is. And then you build these organoid cell systems, and then you test your drug and you see an effect. That is something that, beyond the idea, provides you some level of proof, preclinical proof of principle or concept that it might work. I think that's, for me, if I want to be very simplistic, if you have that, then that's worth doing. But with the presentation, I'm happy to make this presentation available. So if that helps, so I'm happy to send it. But the reason I listed all those points in the due diligence process is because thinking about it very early on is very helpful, because you don't need to have all the answers. I mean, you certainly don't need to do the net present value calculation and all that stuff. I mean, but at least have an idea. Oh, right. So what would be the potential clinical program? What are other people are doing? Let's just check. I mean, and literally with all these, artificial intelligence bots coming online. I mean, you can actually ask, who else is developing drug in this area? What's the stage of development? And you will be able to generate a lot of lot of data for yourself. And if you actually go and talk to, these venture builders with some of this data in hand, even if it's not perfect, you're going to stand out. They're going to say, oh, bloody hell, they are thinking about this. They are understanding the key, the key aspects of evaluating the drug. I mean, very often, if you're a researcher, you don't really care about any of this stuff. I mean, you live in the paradigm of research, but it helps, and it's not a huge exercise. I mean, you sit down, bit of Googling, it's a couple of weeks work, and then you've done a lot of it at a certain level, of course, but still, it helps your thinking as well. That's why I was listing these. It's not because it's helpful. It really helps the researcher, and if the researcher comes better prepared, it obviously makes the process much more efficient with any builder who comes across. And just as a subjective, I mean, you look pretty then, because you need to stand out, because the opportunities are just endless. There are so many people trying to raise capital, right? And if you come up with something more than the others beyond the science, then you stand out, and that helps.
Yeah, thank you. That was very useful. I don't know if there are any other questions. Let me check again the panel. I don't see hands.
I think Gozi has a question.
Sorry.
I was struggling with the icons. How important do you think is that you're backed up by, established people who prove that you can do it? How difficult is it to be completely fresh-faced and say, hey, I know how to do it, trust me on this?
Well, it depends where you think. So if you have a startup company, right? I mean, there are different levels to this. If you are a researcher and then you just go to a tech transfer office and here's my research, let's try to partner up with a venture builder like NLC, early stage. You don't need to have the, all this entrepreneurial and clinical development expertise. I mean, if your science is sound, if you really show commitment to this, that's good enough. If you are a startup company and you go to raise capital, then essentially what they are going to be judging you by, and that's a next level up, is are you going to be able to execute the business plan? Mm-hmm. Now, and what do they base their decision on? I mean, you need to provide proof points that, oh, I know what, going to the FDA is like. I know what the critical elements of an investigation new drug application is. I know how it, and you need to show it. I mean, it's enough you to say, look, if I get the capital, I'm going to have 5 advisors that are going to work with me on that. But you need to prove that you know how to execute the plan. It doesn't mean that you as an entrepreneur who starts it at that stage have to be someone who's done it 5 times before, because there's always a first time. I mean, you don't become an experienced entrepreneur out of nothing. So, but you need to be able to show that you build teams and very often external support that can help you with. So I'll give you an example. You want to do something, go and talk to some key opinion leaders who would join your advisory board. At the beginning, you don't even have to pay them. You say, look, I can't pay you. Can I just have your names? And then if I get financing, then I'll give you money. I mean, seriously, it goes like that. Because how can you pay them? You don't have the money. But at least, or go to some companies that do regulatory support or clinical development planning and say, can I get a quote? How much is going to be? This is the program. They're going to do that for you. They're going to give you a very detailed program and quote, which doesn't cost you a single penny, but you can put it in your business plan. So you need to show that you think about it, and there are ways to execute the business plan. Essentially, you don't need to be experienced. If you show that, then they will see that this person is serious about this.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Simon, if there is time for one more question, I still have one more. I'm not sure if there is anybody else first, because I already did my first question, but let me check. No, there are no hands that I see. So then I go ahead. My question, Simon, is that fine? Okay.
That's fine. Yep.
Yeah, the question I have, Gabor, is about, if you place yourself in the shoes of scientists that, as we have today in the audience, and in a research setting, a group of researchers, usually there is the leader of the group, and then there is a number of scientists at different levels of maturity working on the team. And when there is a technology that emerges from those groups, so they think about how can I take this into a company and how to make an impact with it. And the team has to decide, who will be the person supporting behind, is that needed or not? So my question is about in the way how you build the ventures at NLC, how do you involve the scientists on the team of the company? Can you talk about it, examples, like, is that really needed? Is that not? How, and do you need the more senior, the more junior? How does that happen?
Well, practically, you always need the scientists. Even if NLC forms the company and then NLC would recruit, let's say, a CEO, we would always look to have the commitment of the scientists behind the team, because that's the bread and butter of it. Is if you just have a patent, you need a lot more work to be done. So it takes a number of forms. Usually, it is the thought leader, who leads the research team. That either comes on board or he or she designates someone, but usually these are not the junior scientists. Usually these are either the inventor. The inventor can be the most brilliant 17-year-old who started university at the age of 15. That could happen. I'm not saying it happens a lot, but there are cases like. But anyway, for a serious point, so whoever invented this, or if it's a team effort, whoever is the thought leader within that, they can be the chief scientific officer of the company. They can be part-time. They can be the head of the advisory board. There are ways it depends. It usually very depends how much they want to be involved. If they say, look, I want to, stay at university, but I can spend a day a week working in this company, then we would work out a routine that they work a day a week. If they say, essentially, I want to I'll still stay at university, but I want to dedicate half of my life to this company, then they take the role of whatever in the company on the scientific front. So we can do that. We merge science to business, and then usually that is, in my experience, I see the teams actually work very well in that setting.
Okay, thank you. I don't see more questions, so I just want to thank you for being here today, for presenting your model and sharing your experience.
Thank you for the opportunity. So I guess for the students hanging there, you only have like 3 grueling days to go or something, right?
one and a half to be exact.
All right, fair enough. Okay, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.